Even though Japanese occupied Manchuria in 1931, Chinese did not stop fighting against the Japanese. There were many group of soldiers that were on the warlords before the occupation kept fighting against the Japanese. In 1936, Chinese Communist Party decided to organize these soldiers into Northeast Anti-Japanese United Army. Korean resistance fighters against Japanese in Manchuria participated in the effort of United Army by Chinese. They were in and out of Korea and fighting guerrilla wars, and they could not stand alone without aid of Chinese. Kim Il-sung was one of them, and he troubled the Japanese troops in Korea enough to be reported in Korean major newspapers, and he became quite famous for that. There were about 10,000 Korean soldiers in the Chinese United Army, and the prominent leaders were Kim Il-sung, Kim Chek, Cheon, and Choi Yong-gun. By 1939, Koreans in the United Army harassed the Kwangdong Japanese Army quite a bit, but Kwangdong Japanese Army began to crack down these people quite seriously since 1936, and by 1942 they were almost decimated, and leaders had to flee to Soviet Union, and they couldn't do much when they were in Soviet Union because Soviet Union and Japan signed the Neutrality Pact in 1941, but they came back in 1945 when Soviet invaded Manchuria, and they became the leaders of North Korea in the army and in the government with the assistance of the Soviet Union. The Korean resistance fighters and the Korean Provisional government were encouraged very much when the Sino-Japanese War broke out, because Korea and China would have Japan as a common enemy. Communications between Kuomintang government in China and the Korean Provisional government were intensified. On March 1941, the Korean Provisional government headed by Kim Il-sung created the Korean Liberation Army with the help of Chiang Kai-shek of China. Some Korean Japanese soldiers who were fighting the war in China against Chinese defected to Chinese army, and then they came to Korean Liberation Army. Even some officers who fled from Japanese army and walked about 3,000 miles to come to Korean Provisional government in Chongqing. The Korean Liberation Army was funded by Kuomintang government of China, and they were on the surveillance of Chinese intelligence. Basically, they belonged to Chinese army, and they were not placed on the combat duties, and what they were doing was basically use the Japanese language skills of Koreans. They did propaganda radio broadcasting and the leaflet drops, and also they did the prisoners interrogation. In 1944, Korean Liberation Army became independent of Chinese government, and in March 1945 they began to cooperate with the U.S. Army in China. OSS, the Office of Strategic Service of United States, was in contact with Korean Liberation Army, and they drew up the plan that they would infiltrate to Korean Peninsula. The plan was called Eagle Project and was to recapture Seoul in September 1945. On August 7, 1945, Kim Gu met William Donovan, who was the head of the OSS branch of China, and discussed about the plan in detail. But on August 6, 1945, atomic bomb was dropped in Hiroshima already, and the war was ending. So the plan was cancelled. Kim Gu wrote in his diary that predicted the grim picture of Korean Peninsula after liberation from Japan because the lack of Korean participation on a liberation process. As German defeat became apparent, three heads of Allied forces, Winston Churchill of United Kingdom, Franklin Roosevelt of United States, and Joseph Stalin of Soviet Union, met at Yalta in Crimea in Soviet Union to discuss about the post-war problems. United States was having too many casualties in fighting against the Japanese in Pacific Island, and did not have enough troops to deal with the Kwangdong Japanese army in Manchuria. So Franklin Roosevelt asked Joseph Stalin to invade Manchuria. Stalin promised Roosevelt that he would invade Manchuria in 3 months after German defeat was assured, with 3 conditions. 1. Recognition of Mongolian independence. 2. Right to manage Manchurian Railway, and right to lease Port Arthur in Liaodong Peninsula. 3. Cession of Karafuto and the Kuril Islands from Japan. Germany was defeated in May 1945, and heads of Allied forces met in Potsdam in Germany from July 17th to August 2nd in 1945. In this time, Harry Truman attended instead of Franklin Roosevelt. On July 26, 1945, Potsdam Declaration was announced. It gave Japan an ultimatum to surrender unconditionally or meet prompt and utter destruction. And Truman told Stalin that the US had weapons of unusual force, but Stalin already knew that US had atomic bomb because Soviet spy already infiltrated Manhattan Project. In November 1943, during Tehran Conference, Joseph Stalin told Churchill and Roosevelt that the Soviet Union would enter the Pacific War, and he began to build up troops around Manchuria. Japan had been watching the movement of troops and logistics on Trans-Siberian railways, but Stalin was moving them on land vehicles, and Japan could not notice it. On August 6, 1945, the US dropped atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan, and hours before the second explosion of atomic bomb on Nagasaki, Japan, Soviet Union invaded Manchuria. It was exactly 3 months after the defeat of Germany on May 9, 1945. The Kwangdong Army of Japanese Imperial Army was one of the best army in the world, but now The soldiers didn't have much desire to fight, and they were poorly equipped because of short of supply. Red Army of Soviet Union advanced swiftly, and by 2nd of September 1945, Soviet Union occupied Mongolia, Manchuria, and North Korea. On August 10, 1945, one day after atomic bomb had dropped on Nagasaki, Japan, Japanese Emperor announced that he would recognize Potsdam Declaration by Allied forces. It meant Japan would surrender. The Japanese government, General of Korea, did not have any official notice from Japanese government in Tokyo that Japan would surrender, but they heard the radio broadcasting of the emperor's announcement that he would accept the Potsdam Declaration. So they began to draw up the evacuation plan of Japanese residents and troops in Korea. By then, the Japanese government in Korea thought that Soviet Union would enter Seoul, Korea, and they had to surrender to them.